Most welcome to 1309 and 3 conclusions has come up to 1308. Westerners do not accept and both, but it's always and or both. It is either form or content. Most usually it is content that is more important. And C, exclusion, inclusion. And the example coming from Nisbett there was that the good person in the West cannot make money. You cannot help someone on the wayside and then ask for a bit of money. Too good to hear. How many times did that not happen in India, where I met a guru and then he asked for some money. And me as a Westerner, stuck in the and or both, always felt indignated by that. And I also remember a huge discussion. Some European interested in Hinduism was really aggressive about there being a fee to enter temples in India. Like that would have mattered, like that would have made the temples evil. It goes to show that we are incredibly imbibed with this sort of exclusion thinking. And this is of course the reason why the Klein bottle can be such a healing device to take away the effects of this and either. I will continue with the text of Richard Nisbett. The geography of thought, and it is most definitely thought-provoking. Excuse me. I continue where I left off. Japan has had a capitalist economy for more than 100 years, and capitalism can be expected to promote values of independence, freedom, and rationalism. Yet there are numberless signs that Japan has changed little in many social respects, and we find large differences between the way Japanese and Westerners perceive the world and think about it. capitalism itself has been altered to cohere with Japanese social values. Company loyalty, team spirit, consultative management, and cooperativeness across industries all arose from Japanese social values. Many held them to be largely responsible for the Japanese miracle. Of economic development in the post-World War II period. Indeed, it was widely assumed 15 years ago that the West would have to move toward Japanese forms of management and business practices in order to be able to compete. Of course, Japan's current economic woes are widely attributed to essentially the same social values as its former success. Many Western observers, and some of the same ones in fact, now regard those values as liabilities, resulting in too much reluctance to downsize and too much readiness to make loans to friends in companies having dubious economic prospects. Japan has had a democratic form of government since shortly after World War II, but its constitution was written for it by Americans, and many would say that the government more nearly resembles an oligarchy than a democracy. At least until very recently. And in any case, it's not clear how long a nation has to be a democracy before one can say it is likely to remain that way, especially when there are serious economic strains. China, of course, shows little interest in democracy at this point. Or at any rate, it certainly looks like its adherents have an enormous job cut out for them. China's embrace of capitalism is also less than convincing at this point. Korea seems to take more wholeheartedly to free market practices, but democracy is scarcely 5 years old in that country. And both countries, of course, remain heavily Eastern in a cognitive sense. As Huntington observed, Westerners tend to confuse modernization, defined as industrialization, a more complex occupational structure, increased wealth and social mobility, greater literacy and urbanization, with westernization. But societies other than Japan have become modern without becoming very Western. These include Singapore, Taiwan, and to a lesser degree Iran. Anyone assuming that modernization can only bring more Westernization should be given pause by the current estimate that by 2007 the most common language used in the internet would be Chinese, and the prediction by some economists that within a few years as much as half the world's international air traffic will involve travel through Pacific Asia. In short, values continue to diverge, and anyone who thinks it's not confusing the drinking of Cokes and the building of computers with Westernization. Convergence. But a third view should be considered, which is that the world may be in for a convergence rather than continued divergence. But a convergence based not purely on Westernization, but also on Easternization and on new cognitive forms based on the blending of social systems and values. There are certainly indications that the West finds attraction in the East, while the rest of the world drinks Cokes and wear jeans. Westerners are rapidly fusing their cuisines with Eastern ones. Korea's populace is now 1/3 Christian, but the countless resorts in the Catskill Mountains, formerly catering to a middle-class Jewish clientele, are rapidly transforming themselves into centers for the study of Buddhism, which is gaining US adherents at a much more rapid rate than mainline Protestantism. Many mainstream Western doctors accept some of the general notions of holistic medicine, even recommending ancient Asian treatments in lieu of modern Western ones for ailments ranging from headache to nausea. More importantly, the need to treat the whole person rather than attack the problem has gained wide currency. Millions of Americans, many of them not otherwise trendier than the soccer mom or insurance agents next door, now practice yoga and Tai Chi. Many Americans who find the traditions of individualism to be alienating look to Eastern's forms of community as possible cures for social anomie. Whole industries now practice Japanese pioneered forms of employer-employee relations, while Easterners learn to emphasize debate in education. Westerners experiment with logical systems that do not require that a proposition be either true or false. Great 20th century physicists, such as Niels Bohr, have attributed their progress in quantum mechanics to an appreciation of Eastern ideas. At a time when Western primatologists believe that only the mother-infant bond was an important relationship for chimpanzees, Japanese primatologists were seeing complex interrelationships in stable chimpanzee societies. Initially dismissed, the Japanese view is now the universally accepted one in the field. And although I have not stressed the point, it should be clear that the ideas in this book owe as much to Eastern thinkers and experimentalists as to Western. I firmly believe that the entry of East Asians into social sciences is going to transform how we think about human thought and behavior across the board. If social practices, values, beliefs, and scientific themes are to converge, then we can expect the differences in thought processes would also begin to evaporate. There is in fact evidence that changes in social practices and even changes in temporary states of social orientation can change the way people perceive and think. Recall that many of our studies included Asian Americans, since they have very different social experiences from those of Asians. We would expect that their perceptions and patterns of thought would resemble those of other Westerners to a substantial degree. And in fact, the perceptual patterns and reasoning styles of such participants were always immediate between those of Asians and European Americans. And sometimes they were actually indistinguishable from those of European Americans. Other work suggesting that cognitive modifiability is possible comes from the study of genuinely bicultural people. Evidence suggests that such people do not merely have values and beliefs that are intermediate between two cultures, but that their cognitive processes can be intermediate as well, or at least they can alternate between forms of reasoning characteristic of one culture versus another. Recall the studies on causal perception showing that people from Hong Kong can be primed by showing them Western symbols such as Mickey Mouse and the US Capitol, and that this prompts them to answer causal questions in a more Western fashion than if they are primed by Eastern symbols such as temples and dragons. Similarly, Asian Americans answered questions about physical causality in a more Western fashion if they were first asked to recall an experience that made their identity as an American apparent to them if they recalled an experience that made salient their identity as an Asian. Shinobu Kitayama and his colleagues found evidence that cognitive processes could be modified even after relatively limited amounts of time spent in another culture. In particularly, elegant demonstration, they presented Japanese and American participants with several examples of a line drawn within a square. And they were taken to another part of the room and shown a square of a different size than the one they had just seen. They were asked to draw a line inside the square, either on the same length that they had just seen, or that was proportionally the same. Americans were more accurate in drawing a line than that was the same absolute length, showing they were more capable of ignoring the context. Japanese were more accurate in drawing a line that was the same relative length. Showing that they were more capable of relating object to context. Then Kitayama and colleagues went a step further and looked at the behavior of Americans who had been living in Japan for a period of time, and Japanese who had been living in America for a period of time. Americans who had been living in Japan shifted in a decidedly Japanese direction. Japanese living in America were virtually indistinguishable from Americans. The study does not really prove that time in another culture produces such dramatic changes in behavior. Other interpretations are viable, including the possibility that people who go to live in another culture are very much like them before they ever get there. But the results are strongly suggestive that cognitive processes can be modified by dint of merely living for a time in another culture. In a sense, we are all bicultural with respect to social constraints and social interests. Our awareness of connections with other people, as well as how much we want to associate with other people, varies from time to time. Of these fluctuating differences in the relevance of other people associated with the differences in perception and thought. Social psychologist Ulrich Kühnen and his colleagues have conducted some remarkable studies that indicate that simple laboratory manipulations of social orientation have an effect on the way we think. For example, they try to prime an interdependent collectivist orientation by having their participants read a paragraph and circle all first-person plural pronouns as we, us, our. And tried to prime an independent, individualist orientation by having them circle all first-person singular pronouns. I, me, mine. They found that interdependence prime participants were more field-dependent than were independence prime participants, as indicated by the embedded figure tests. That is, they found it harder to recognize a simple figure that was enmeshed in a more complicated context. Kühnen and Daphna Oyserman, using the same manipulation, found that people were able to remember the contexts in which they had seen particular objects. The result of perceptual binding of object and field. Better after interdependence priming than after independence priming. Thus, we all function in some respects more like Easterners some of the time, and more like Westerners some of the time. A shift in characteristic social practices shifted in a decidedly Japanese direction. Japanese living in America were virtually indistinguishable from Native Americans. The study does not really prove that time in another culture produces such dramatic changes in behavior. Other interpretations are viable, including the possibility that people who go to live in another culture are very much like them before they ever get there. But the results are strongly suggestive that cognitive processes can be modified by a dint of merely living for a time in another culture. In a sense, we are all bicultural with respect to social constraints and social interests. Our awareness of connections with other people, as well as how much we want to associate with other people, varies from time to time. Are these fluctuating? Good pause. Sorry about the pause, it was a change of room here. We continue with the epilogue from Geography of Thought. And I just mentioned the experiments of Kühne and Daphne Oysterman. And they were talking about priming and how we could be primed just by the manner of using pronouns. For example, they tried to prime an interdependent collectivistic orientation by having their participants read a paragraph and circle all first person plural pronouns. The priming make difference in the embedded figure tests. That is, they found it harder to recognize simple figure that was enmeshed in a more complicated context. Kühne and Daphne Oysterman, using the same manipulation, found that people were able to remember the contexts in which they had seen particular objects. The result of perceptual binding of object and field, better after interdependence priming than after independence priming. Thus, we all function in some respects more like Easterners some of the time, and more like Westerners some of the time. A shift in characteristic social practices could therefore be expected to produce a shift in typical patterns of perception and thought. So I believe the twain shall meet by virtue of each moving in the direction of the other. East and West may contribute to a blended world where social and cognitive aspects of both regions are represented but transformed. Like the individual ingredients in a stew that are recognizable but altered as they alter the whole. It may not be too much to hope that this stew will contain the best of each culture. So that was the end of the epilogue. I will do something that I've done before. It's a bit odd. I will start with the first chapter. The name of the chapter is very enticing. The Syllogism and the Tao. Seldom have I read a rubric more well put. Even haven't read the chapter, I know directly at least the direction where it's going. More than 1 billion people in the world today claim intellectual inheritance from ancient Greece. More than 2 billion are the heirs of ancient Chinese traditions of thought. The philosophies and achievements of the Greeks and Chinese of 2,500 years ago were remarkably different. As were the social structures and conceptions of themselves. And as I hope to show in this chapter, the intellectual aspects of each society make sense in light of their social characteristics. The ancient Greeks and agency. There is an ancient theatre at Epidaurus in Greece that holds 14,000 people, built into a hillside. The theatre has a spectacular view of mountains and pine trees. Its acoustic acoustics are such that it is possible to hear a piece of paper being crumbled on the stage from any location in the theater. Greeks of the classical period, from the 6th to the 3rd century BC, travel for long periods under difficult conditions to attend plays and poetry readings at Epidaurus from dawn to dusk for several days in a row. To us today, people's love of the theater and their willingness to endure some hardship to indulge, it may not seem terribly odd. But among the great civilizations of the day, including Persia, India, and the Middle East, as well as China, it is possible to imagine only the Greeks feeling free enough, being confident enough, in their ability to control their own lives, to go on a long journey for the sole purpose of aesthetic enjoyment. The Greeks' contemporaries lived in more or less autocratic societies, in which the king's will was law, and to defy it was to court death. It would not have been in a ruler's interest to allow his subjects to wander about the countryside, even if his subjects' ties to the land and the routines of agriculture had allowed them to imagine going on a long journey for purposes of recreation. Equally astonishing, even to us today, is the fact that the entire Greek nation laid down its tools, including its arms, if city-states were at war with one another, to participate in the Olympics as athletes or audience. The Greeks, more than any other ancient peoples, and in fact more than most people on the planet today, had a remarkable sense of personal agency. The sense that they were in charge of their own lives and free to act as they chose. one definition of happiness for the Greeks was that it consisted of being able to exercise their powers in pursuit of excellence in a life free from constraints. A strong sense of individual identity accompanied the Greek sense of personal agency. Whether it is the Greeks or the Hebrews who invented individualism is a matter of some controversy. But there is no doubt that the Greeks view themselves as unique individuals with distinctive attributes and goals. This would have been true at least by the time of Homer in the 8th or 9th century BC. Both gods and humans in the Odyssey and the Iliad have personalities that are fully formed and individuated. Moreover, the differences among individuals were of substantial interest to Greek philosophers. The Greek sense of agency fueled a tradition of debate. Homer makes it clear that a man is defined almost as much by his ability to debate as by his prowess as a warrior. A commoner could challenge even a king and not only live to tell the tale, but occasionally sway an audience to his side. Debates occurred in the marketplace, the political assembly, and even in military settings. Uniquely among ancient civilizations, great matters of state, as well as the most ordinary questions, were often decided by public rhetorical combat rather than by the authoritarian fiat. Tyrannies were not common in Greece, and when they arose, they were frequently replaced by oligarchies, or beginning in the 5th century BC by democracies. The constitutions of some cities had mechanisms to prevent officials from becoming tyrants. For example, the city of Drerus on Crete prohibit a man from holding the office of Cosmos, until 10 years had gone by since the last time he held the office. As striking as the Greeks' freedom and individuality is the sense of curiosity about the world. Aristotle thought that curiosity was the uniquely defining property of human beings. St. Luke said of the Athenians of a later era, "They spend their time in nothing else but to tell or to hear some new thing." The Greeks, far more than their contemporaries, speculated about the nature of the world they found themselves in and created models of it. They constructed these models by categorizing objects and events and generating rules about them that were sufficiently precise for systematic description and explanation. This characterized their advance in, some have even said, invention of, the fields of physics, astronomy, axiomatic geometry, formal logic, rational philosophy, natural history, and ethnography. All these invented by the Greek, laying the foundations of Western culture. And some of these parts are also the strands we pointed out earlier. It's and or both, not and both. It is linear rather than circular. And exclusion, cutting out something. And that is even to the extent of actually cutting somebody. Surgery is a really Western way of thinking. Taking away the cyst, the tumor, the broken leg will heal. It is seen as something extraneous. Take away the offending part and the person will be healed. It never happened in China that way. Surgery was unknown until the 20th century, when it was introduced by Westerners. I round off there. I put a point in the book. I think I did anyway. Carefully. Page 4. And I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.